I was 33 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin in the northern part of the United Kingdom, somewhere on the edge of the Cairngorms. It was early October of 2017, the kind of cold that creeps in early and sits under your clothes no matter how warm you think you are. I had taken time off work because my head felt packed with noise from months of stress, and I wanted silence. I wanted a place where I could walk, breathe cold air, and clear my thoughts. The cabin I rented was small, old, and plain. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that twisted deeper into the trees than I expected. When I arrived, I remember shutting off the engine and hearing nothing but wind sliding through the pines and the distant rush of a river. The cabin had stone walls, dark wooden beams, and a roof that looked like it had survived storms older than me. Inside, it smelled of old firewood, damp coats, and something like old newspapers. I liked it immediately, felt cut off from everything. No phone signal, no neighbors, no lights from faraway houses. Just trees, hills, and long stretches of cold, open land. My first day was calm. I unpacked, stacked some firewood, and walked along a narrow path behind the cabin. The ground was soft and covered with brown needles and scattered rocks. I found a small stream and followed it until the sky turned orange. When I returned, I cooked a simple meal, lit the fireplace, and sat on the single wooden chair, listening to the crackling. There was no fear then, only the kind of quiet that made me feel separate from everything I normally carried inside me. But the second night changed everything. Started with a sound I didn't understand. I had been lying on the small bed in the corner of the cabin, reading under a dim lamp. The windows were old and thin, and they rattled quietly every time the wind pushed against them. I was used to that after the first night, but around midnight, something different mixed with the wind. A sharp noise, like something lightly scraping against the wall outside. First, I ignored it. Old buildings make noises. Animals move through forests. Branches fall. But the scraping wasn't random. It dragged for a few seconds, stopped, then dragged again, slower the second time. It sounded low, near the base of the cabin wall, like someone running a piece of metal along the stones. I sat up. The fire had burned low and cast weak orange flashes around the room. My skin prickled with that tight, cold feeling your body gets when it senses something wrong before your mind understands why. I listened, trying to tell myself it was just a branch pushed by the wind. But the wind was barely moving then. The tree line was still. I waited for the noise again, and when it returned, it came from a different part of the wall, closer to the window. I felt something heavy settle in my stomach. I moved toward the window quietly, slowly, not even sure what I expected to see in that darkness. I didn't lift the curtain all the way, just enough to look outside through a thin gap. I didn't see anything at first, just blackness, broken only by the pale outline of trees. But then something shifted near the edge of the clearing. A shape, person's shape, a woman. She stood completely still, facing the cabin, half hidden by the shadow of a large pine. I could only make out the pale oval of her face and the long outline of her coat. She didn't move. She didn't step forward. She just stood there like she had been standing there for hours. A cold wave rolled through me so hard my hands trembled. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were pressing in. I dropped the curtain, stepped back, and tried to breathe. There was no reason for anyone to be there. The nearest house was more than 4 kilometers away, and even if someone was lost, no one would stand silently in the dark like that, watching a cabin without knocking or calling out. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake in the chair, fire lit, hands tight around a metal poker, listening for more sounds. The scraping never returned, but every hour or so I checked the window again, and each time I saw nothing but black trees and patches of moonlight. When morning came, I stepped outside. The air was colder than the day before, and frost coated the grass in thin white lines. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the walls where I heard the scraping. The stones showed faint marks, thin, light scratches that hadn't been there when I arrived. They were not deep, but they were new. I felt a deep unease settle under my ribs. I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, a deer brushing against the wall, a fox, something normal. But animals don't stand upright in coats. Animals don't watch cabins from shadows. By afternoon, I had convinced myself enough to stay. Leaving felt like running from something I couldn't explain, and a part of me refused to let fear push me away from a trip I had planned for months. I spent the day walking again, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, checking tree lines, listening for steps behind me. Every snapped twig made my heart jump. That night, the fear came back worse. It was past 1 a.m. when I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, moving along the porch. The floorboards creaked under weight, not wind. I sat up instantly, heart thudding so hard I felt it in my throat. The fire was burning low again, throwing long shifting shadows across the room. I didn't go to the window this time. I didn't want to stand there face to face with whoever was out there. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The steps moved to the side of the cabin, then to the back, then silence. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my skin. I waited for minutes that felt like hours. I kept expecting the door handle to move, expecting the windows to shake, expecting something to announce itself. But nothing happened, only quiet, and the quiet was somehow worse. I didn't sleep again, not even for a second. At sunrise, I walked around the cabin again. This time I found footprints, small, thin, clearly made by boots. They circled the cabin in an uneven line. I followed them until the trees grew too dense to see them clearly. My hands shook the entire time. I knew then that staying another night would be a mistake. Whatever I saw, whoever walked around the cabin, they weren't lost. They weren't wandering. They were watching me. I packed my things fast. I kept checking the tree line every minute. The forest felt wrong now. Too quiet, too aware of me. I loaded my bag into the car, locked the cabin door even though it felt pointless, and got inside the car. But before I started the engine, I saw her again. She stood at the far edge of the clearing, closer than she had been the first night. Her coat was long and dark, almost blending into the trees. Her hair hung straight down her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't tilt her head. She just stared at the cabin, at me, like she already knew I had seen her, like she wanted me to. I didn't wait another second. I turned the key, pressed the accelerator, and drove down the dirt path so fast the tires threw stones behind me. I didn't slow down until the cabin was far behind the trees and the road straightened into something familiar and safe. Only when I reached the main road did I finally breathe normally again. I never went back to that cabin. I never told the owner what I saw. I didn't even ask for a refund for the remaining days. I wanted no connection to that place at all. Months passed, then a year. I tried to forget the woman and the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. But some nights, when I wake up unexpectedly and the room feels too quiet, I remember the way she stood in the clearing, still as a shadow, her face pale against the dark trees. And I always check the window before I turn the light back off. Not because I expect to see her, but because part of me is terrified that one day, far from that cabin, far from the forest, I actually might. I had been driving for hours through the dense forests of northern Minnesota. It was late October, 1998, and the air had that sharp, bitter edge that signaled the approach of winter. I was 32, rugged from years of outdoor work, and had spent countless weekends alone in the woods. But this trip felt different. I was heading to a small hunting cabin I'd rented from a local outfitter, tucked away near a remote lake called Black Pine. The directions were simple but vague. Turn left at the fallen birch, follow the track for 2 miles, cabin on the right. My truck's headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had rolled in, and the wind rattled the bare branches like dry bones. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how isolated the place really was. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs, with a sagging roof and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The surrounding trees pressed close, as if they were watching, and the lake lay hidden behind a wall of pine and spruce. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. I parked the truck in front of the cabin, grabbed my pack, and opened the creaking door. Inside, dust floated in thin beams of light, and the wooden floor groaned under my weight. There was a small fireplace, a single bed with a moth-eaten blanket, and a rough wooden table with a chair. I dropped my pack and started a fire, the flames licking the old stones of the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the walls. I had come here to hunt deer, to spend a few days in silence and solitude. But as night fell, I realized just how alone I was. The wind rose, shaking the trees, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sounded amplified in the darkness. I sat near the fire, cleaning my rifle, and the forest outside became a place of shifting shapes and whispered sounds. At one point, I thought I saw something move beyond the window, a dark shape, crouched low, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. I told myself it was a deer or a trick of the light, but unease had settled in my chest. Sleep came fitfully. I kept waking to the sounds outside, the crunch of leaves, a low, distant thump, like something heavy walking on the forest floor. By dawn, I had convinced myself it was an animal, probably a bear or a moose passing through. I dressed, grabbed my rifle, and left the cabin to scout the area. The forest was eerily quiet, every bird silent, every squirrel absent from its usual scurrying. I moved slowly, noting the fresh tracks in the mud. They were larger than any deer's, and the stride was too long to be a coyote or fox. I froze, crouched low, trying to read the prints. They seemed human, but too wide, too heavy. Shaking off the unease, I chalked it up to old logging equipment or maybe some hunter who had passed through recently. The first day passed without incident. I spotted a few deer, marked them, but didn't take a shot. The sun was low when I returned to the cabin, exhausted, and I built a fire to cook a simple meal. As darkness settled, I noticed something new, fresh tracks leading right up to the cabin. Human tracks, big, bare or in work boots, pressed deep into the soft earth. I stepped closer, examining them. They ended at the edge of the forest and didn't continue inside. My pulse quickened, but I reasoned that maybe someone had wandered past the cabin earlier in the day. I tried to ignore it. That night, I slept poorly. I kept waking to noises outside, footsteps circling, crunching the dry leaves and sticks. Every time I looked, the shadows seemed to shift, as though the forest itself were breathing around me. Around midnight, a sharp rap on the door made me freeze. My heart jumped. The wind had been strong, but that was deliberate, a knock-like sound. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the door, listening. Nothing. I looked out the window, but the darkness was complete, the fog rolling in low and thick. I stayed awake until the fire died, sitting in the dark, rifle across my knees. The following morning, I found more evidence of something, or someone, watching me. Marks on the windows, smudged prints on the wooden frames, broken branches near the cabin. The tracks from the night before had returned, closer, almost circling the cabin now. Fear settled deep in my stomach, gnawing at me. I packed a small bag, considering leaving, but the truck was down the path a mile away, and the fog had settled so thickly that visibility was next to nothing. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I stacked firewood across the front door, wedged a chair under the handle, and checked my rifle repeatedly. The sun disappeared early behind the heavy clouds, and by late afternoon, the forest was black. The noises came again, closer, more deliberate. Branches snapped, and something heavy trampled through the underbrush. My dog, a German shepherd named Max, growled from beside me, hackles raised, ears pricked forward. I tried to keep calm, but I could feel the presence, moving around the cabin, circling, testing. The night stretched on like a living thing. Every hour, every minute, something shifted outside. I heard it walking in the snowless dirt, stopping and listening, then moving again. At one point, Max barked furiously, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow. A man, maybe, but hunched large with something glinting in his hand. He didn't approach fully, but the weight of being watched crushed me. I stayed near the fire, rifle ready, heart pounding so loud I thought the intruder would hear it. Around 3 a.m., the thing moved away, or maybe it had just been watching and lost interest. Exhaustion overtook me, and I slept fitfully in the chair, Max curled tightly at my feet. When I awoke at dawn, everything had changed. The tracks were gone, the forest eerily quiet. The cabin was untouched, nothing stolen, nothing broken. My fear from the night before still lingered, a heavy weight pressing down. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my things, loaded Max into the truck, and started down the narrow track through the forest. The trees pressed close, the fog still thick, but I moved steadily. About a mile from the cabin, I saw them. Tracks, fresh, leading off to the side, deeper into the forest. They were human, enormous, and they ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had disappeared into the trees. My stomach churned. Whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin wasn't far behind. I didn't stop. I drove through the fog, following the faint sunlight breaking through the clouds, until I finally reached the main road. Relief washed over me in heavy, trembling waves. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest lay silent, still, almost ordinary again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had been watched, hunted in my own refuge, and the memory of that night, the feeling of eyes in the dark, would stay with me forever. I never returned to Black Pine. The cabin remained empty, abandoned to the forest. People said the area was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for hunting. I knew the truth. Some places in the woods are not quiet at all, and some nights, no matter how careful you are, the shadows have already decided you are their prey. I hadn't planned on spending the night alone in the cabin that October of 2007. I was 28 then, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, working as a freelance photographer, chasing landscapes and wildlife. I'd driven out of town after a week of editing and deadlines, just wanting to get away from the constant hum of people and screens. The cabin was supposed to be an unassuming little place, tucked away on the edge of Coconino National Forest, the kind of spot that promised quiet, solitude, and the occasional wildlife for photographs. I'd heard stories from locals about how remote it was, but I chalked it up to the usual campfire exaggerations. Wolves, mountain lions, maybe the occasional bear. I never believed in anything like skinwalkers. I arrived around sunset, the sky a mix of burnt orange and deep purple. The dirt road leading to the cabin had grown rougher as I went, full of ruts and loose stones that rattled the tires of my old Jeep Cherokee. The cabin itself looked older than it had in the photos online. Rough-hewn logs blackened by years of sun and smoke, the windows clouded with dust. The porch sagged slightly, and one of the boards creaked dangerously underfoot. I didn't mind. It added to the charm, or so I told myself. Inside, it smelled of old pine and something faintly acrid, like burnt hair. The stove was old but usable, the fireplace cold but promising warmth once lit. I unpacked my camera gear and a small backpack of food, and I started a fire in the stove. The logs smoked and hissed, and the wind outside rattled the windows as the sun dropped completely behind the trees. The forest around the cabin was dense, the kind of place where shadows stretched long and moved almost like they were alive. I thought about taking some night shots, but as darkness fell, the forest seemed to swallow light whole. Around 10, after eating a cold sandwich and checking my camera settings, I felt it, a quiet pressure in the air, a shift so subtle I almost ignored it. The wind had dropped completely. Outside, the forest had gone unnaturally silent, the usual calls of owls or rustling of small animals gone. I leaned against the wall, telling myself I was imagining things. Cabin isolation does that to you, I thought. Then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound coming from the far side of the cabin. My heart jumped. It wasn't a footstep, not really. It was heavier, deliberate, like something large moving on dry leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped to the window on the side of the cabin. The light was weak, but I could make out shapes just beyond the treeline. There was movement, jerky, unnatural. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other large animal, but then I noticed the way it moved. Its legs weren't quite right, bending at odd angles, shifting like it was mimicking human motion. My stomach knotted. I tried to rationalize. Coyotes, maybe? A bear? No, this was different. The thing crouched low to the ground, then darted to another patch of trees, moving almost silently. Paused, then cocked its head, as if listening. And then, somehow, I felt it was looking right at me, even though I was behind the window. My chest tightened, and I stepped back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The next hour was pure tension. Every time I thought I had lost sight of it, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye. It didn't make noise like an animal normally would. No growls, no hissing, no calls. Just motion, smooth, deliberate, predatory. I remembered reading stories about skinwalkers in Navajo folklore, about shapeshifters who could mimic animals and even people. I didn't believe in that nonsense, but whatever this was, it wasn't natural. I tried to stay calm. I turned off the lights inside the cabin and sat in the corner, my back against the wall, my camera bag in front of me like a shield. The fire had burned low, leaving the room half dark. Outside, the dragging sound returned, closer this time. I couldn't tell where it was, because the creature didn't move like a normal animal. It seemed to jump from one side of the clearing to another, almost teleporting short distances. My ears picked up a faint breathing, low, raspy, uneven, like something sick or starving. Hours passed like this. I didn't dare leave the cabin. I didn't dare even move. I could hear it circling, testing the boundaries of the cabin, sniffing, scratching. Once, it let out a sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but a guttural mimic of a human cough or a groan. It froze. I froze. The hairs on my neck were standing straight up. By 3 a.m., I knew I couldn't stay idle any longer. My phone had no service, and the Jeep was parked far enough that I doubted I could make it without being noticed. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made noise. I banged on the metal stove with a pot lid, shouted at the top of my lungs, swung a heavy log at the walls. Whatever it was, it paused. I could hear it move away from the cabin, then circle back, slow and deliberate. Then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed up, fire low but constant, camera ready in case I had to see it. Morning came, but it didn't bring relief. The forest was wet with frost, the sun just cresting the distant ridges. I stepped outside carefully. The forest was empty, but the ground told a story. There were tracks, Too many, too strange. Human-shaped, maybe, but stretched and twisted like the creature had feet that bent the wrong way. They started in the trees, circled the cabin, and then disappeared into the ridge behind me. I packed up quickly, too fast to think clearly, and got into the Jeep. My hands shook as I drove back down the dirt road, eyes scanning constantly. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Even when I reached the paved highway, I kept driving until the forest was far behind me. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. They'd think I was crazy. Even now, I know how it looked impossible. But the cabin still exists, still empty, still surrounded by those same twisted trees. Years later, I returned to that region, but I never went back to that cabin. I've taken plenty of wildlife photos in northern Arizona since then, but I always notice the edges of the woods, the shadows, the rustling just beyond where I can see. I don't think I'll ever fully forget that night. The dragging steps in the frost, the way the darkness felt alive, aware, and waiting. What changed me most, though, wasn't the fear itself. It was the knowledge that whatever I saw that night wasn't mythical in the way people tell stories around a campfire. It was real, and it knew me. Now, whenever I hear distant footsteps in the forest at night, I don't just freeze. I check twice, 3 times to make sure I'm not being watched, because that night taught me something I never want to relearn. Some things in the woods aren't just animals. They aren't ghosts. And sometimes you're not just trespassing, they are watching. The ending of that experience was simple, yet clear. I survived because I didn't confront it directly. I stayed quiet when I had to, and I got away. The forest reclaimed the tracks, the frost melted, and the cabin remains abandoned. But the memory never fades. Every time I pass a shadow that moves a little too deliberately, I feel the same prickling unease that night. I understand now that some stories aren't fairy tales. Some things are real, and sometimes the best ending is just making it out alive, carrying the evidence of what exists in the quietest, darkest corners of the world. I had been hiking through the northern woods of Minnesota for hours, the kind of woods that seemed endless, with tall pines and birches rising like silent watchers around me. It was early October of 1987, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves and decaying pine needles. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, stuffed with the usual hiking supplies: water, a small stove, a couple of cans of beans, and a flashlight that barely worked. I had planned to be out here for a day or two, trying to escape the noise of the city. But somewhere along the way, I lost the trail. The thin dirt paths that should have guided me were gone, swallowed by fallen leaves and creeping undergrowth. The sun was sinking fast, painting everything in a dull orange glow, and I realized that nightfall would be coming sooner than I expected. I pushed forward, hoping to find some sign of civilization or at least a clearing. And then, almost like it had been hidden deliberately, I stumbled across it. An old cabin, half swallowed by the forest. Its roof sagged in uneven lines, and the wooden walls were gray with age, cracked in places where rain and winter had crept in. The windows were dirty and dark, some of the glass shattered, leaving jagged edges that reflected the last light of day. I wasn't sure if anyone lived there, but it looked abandoned enough that I could rest inside for a few hours and wait out the dark. The door was swollen from moisture but not locked, so I pushed it open with effort, feeling the cold resistance of warped wood. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I had to be careful not to step where they were soft or broken. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof and walls, illuminating motes of dust that floated like tiny ghosts. There were signs of life or remnants of it. An old metal stove stood against one wall, rusted and blackened with soot. In the corner, a wooden table leaned precariously, and a few broken chairs lay scattered. On the floor, A thin layer of fallen leaves and debris had gathered over the years. It was silent, but not in a comforting way. More like the quiet of a place that had been forgotten for decades. I set my backpack down and explored a little. The cabin had one small bedroom, its door hanging off rusty hinges. The bed frame was empty, except for a few threads of a mattress that had disintegrated. On the floor, I noticed scratches in the wood, small and uneven, as though something had clawed at it, but I couldn't tell if it had been an animal or a person long ago. A faint chill ran down my spine. I reminded myself it was just an old building settling, nothing more. I tried to ignore the feeling, focusing on making the cabin a temporary shelter. As the last light of day faded, shadows deepened in every corner. I lit a small candle I had in my pack, and its flickering flame threw dancing shadows across the walls. That's when I heard it, the first sound, a scraping, low and deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. The sound wasn't strong, but it was enough to make my pulse jump. My eyes darted around the room, and my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon had gotten inside through one of the broken windows. Maybe a branch had fallen outside and scraped the wall. But then it came again, slower this time, like something heavy moving across the floor behind me. I gripped my flashlight and slowly turned toward the kitchen area. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the corner. My breath hitched. It wasn't human. The eyes were too small, too close to the ground. A stray dog or a wild animal? Possibly. But the eyes held a calculating stillness that didn't feel like an animal's panic. The light revealed nothing. When I moved closer, the eyes vanished, replaced by shadows that seemed deeper than the rest of the cabin. My mind raced, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, but the forest outside was dark and endless, and I didn't want to risk falling into a ravine or twisting an ankle in the undergrowth. I had no choice but to stay. Night fully fell, and the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in my coat and tried to sleep near the stove, hoping to keep warm. Every little sound, the creak of a floorboard, the whistle of wind through a hole in the roof, the occasional thump from outside, made me tense. I thought I heard footsteps moving around the cabin at one point, slow and deliberate, stopping whenever I turned my head. I kept reminding myself it was probably my imagination, but the fear felt real in every part of me. It was the kind of fear that made your skin feel tight and your throat dry, like the air itself was pressing down. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke to the smell. It was faint at first, like something wet and metallic, but it grew stronger. My stomach twisted when I realized it smelled like blood. I don't know what compelled me to move, but I got up, heart hammering, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, and I saw it. On the wall near the back corner, smeared streaks of dark red that had dripped down the wood and pooled slightly on the floor. My stomach turned over. Whoever or whatever had been here before me had left evidence. I felt the old fear sharpen into something more urgent. I needed to leave. I grabbed my pack and started toward the door, but the handle felt sticky. I pulled harder, and the door gave way with a groan. Outside, the forest was black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, every shadow looking like a threat. I didn't stop running until I found a small stream, its rushing water guiding me. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a road or a campsite. Hours passed, the cold seeping through my coat, until finally, just before dawn, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was a ranger station, small but solid. Exhausted, shaking, I ran toward it, banging on the door until a ranger opened it. I explained as best I could, and they radioed for backup. When I was finally safe and warm inside the station, they went with me back to the cabin. What we found was enough to make my skin crawl. The cabin had clearly been used by someone recently, someone who had stayed there in secret. The bloodstains were old, dried, but there were signs of recent footprints and discarded cans in the undergrowth. They never found anyone, but the trail of footprints leading into the forest vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. I was told not to go back, that the place was unsafe, and that people sometimes used abandoned cabins like that to hide from the law or from the world. I didn't need more explanation. I had seen enough to know it wasn't safe. It took me days to recover, and even now, years later, I can't forget the smell, the shadows, the way the old cabin seemed to watch me. I never returned to that part of the woods, and I made sure no one I knew went near it either. Sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder if the person or people who had been there were still out there somewhere in those endless woods. I never found out, but I learned something important that night. Not all fear comes from ghosts or stories. Sometimes it comes from real people, real danger, and the knowledge that you are alone in a place where no one can help you. That cabin taught me that, and I will never forget it. It was the autumn of 1998 when I first drove out to my uncle's old farm in eastern Kansas. I had just turned 29, recently divorced, and desperate to escape the city's constant noise. The farm was over 2 hours away from the nearest town, tucked deep in a valley where the river curved around a cluster of aging oaks. The main road ended in a dirt path that twisted through cornfields, overgrown with weeds that bent in the wind, and eventually opened to a clearing where the cabin sat. The cabin itself was small and wooden, built decades before by my great-grandfather. Its boards were weathered, some warped and splintered, with the faint scent of old pine and rot. The roof sagged slightly, and a rusted tin chimney jutted crookedly into the gray sky. I had spent summers here as a kid, running through the fields and fishing in the creek nearby, but back then it had felt safe. Now, standing in the clearing, I realized how much the isolation weighed on you once you were older. I parked my truck near the barn, which leaned precariously, and stepped onto the wooden porch. The boards creaked under my weight. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of decaying leaves and wet soil, and I could hear the soft buzz of insects hiding in the stalks of corn. I opened the front door, which groaned on rusty hinges, and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the weak sunlight coming through the dirty windows. The main room smelled of old wood, must, and the faint, lingering aroma of animals that had long since left. I had come with just the essentials, some clothes, a few cans of food, and a single lantern. The electricity had been cut off years ago, and I relied on a small propane stove in the corner for cooking. I unpacked slowly, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing against me. Out here, the silence was so complete it almost felt alive. The first night passed without incident, though sleep came fitfully. Every groan of the cabin, every creak of the wooden floorboards, set my nerves on edge. The wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere in the fields beyond, a coyote howled. I stayed awake longer than I had planned, watching shadows stretch across the walls. It was on the second evening that I first noticed something strange. I was chopping vegetables near the kitchen window when I caught movement at the edge of the field. At first, I thought it was deer, but the shape was too upright. A man, I realized, standing in the tall, dying corn. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. My heart thudded, and I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows playing in the sunset. But over the next few days, I kept noticing odd things. Footprints in the dirt near the barn, too large for a deer and spaced like someone had been walking slowly. Tools in the shed that I hadn't touched were moved slightly. Once, I found a chair knocked over in the main room, though I was certain I had left it upright. Each time, I felt that creeping sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then, one morning, I woke to find the front gate, which I always kept closed, swung wide open. The latch was broken, That night, I decided I would stay alert. I dragged a chair in front of the door and made sure my lantern was full, keeping the knife from my kitchen on the chair beside me. The following afternoon, I was working in the barn, repairing a broken stall when I heard it. A slow, deliberate rustling outside in the cornfield. My dog, Max, a golden retriever I had brought with me, growled low in his throat and refused to move. I froze, heart hammering, staring toward the edge of the field. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps crunching on the dried leaves. I ran inside the cabin, locking the door behind me, Max following closely. I checked every window. The place felt smaller now, almost suffocating, the shadows stretching further than they should. I didn't sleep that night, sitting by the stove with Max at my side, scanning the windows and listening. By morning, I felt drained, but I had no idea what I was dealing with. Whoever or whatever was out there was patient, watching, moving only when I wasn't looking. The next day, I decided to explore the back of the property. There was an old shed beyond the creek, half collapsed, and I thought maybe I could find clues. The grass had grown high, and the air was damp and sharp. As I neared the shed, I noticed more footprints, this time clear and unmistakably human. They were large, booted prints, leading around the back of the shed and disappearing into the forest line. My stomach sank. Someone had been here recently. I went back to the cabin, heart pounding. I secured every door and window and dragged extra furniture to block them. Max stayed close to me, ears perked, growling whenever a crow cawed or a branch snapped. That night, the quiet seemed heavier, like a weight pressing in from every side. Around midnight, I heard it, a slow scraping on the side of the cabin. My blood ran cold. The noise circled the cabin, moving deliberately, as if testing the walls, looking for a weakness. I grabbed the rifle I had found in the barn and stayed in the corner of the main room, shaking, Max growling by my side. Hours passed. I didn't move. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. The world outside seemed calm again, but I didn't trust it. I spent the morning walking the perimeter, inspecting the ground. There were more footprints, some heading off into the forest. I realized whoever had come here before me was still in the area, probably watching. By the third night, I was exhausted and on edge. I had decided to leave in the morning, but I still needed to survive the night. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin. Max whimpered, sensing the tension. I kept the rifle close and listened. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, deliberate and measured, circling the cabin. I shined the lantern through the windows, but the man stayed just out of view. Eventually, dawn broke. Exhausted and tense, I loaded my truck and prepared to leave. Max stayed alert, ears twitching at every sound. I drove slowly down the dirt path, eyes scanning the tree line, expecting him to appear at any moment. The cabin, once a place of nostalgia, now felt like a trap. When I reached the main road, the sense of being watched faded, though I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't see him, but I knew the cabin and the fields would hold that presence long after I was gone. I didn't return to the farm for years. When I finally did, it had been sold, the land cleared, and a new farmhouse stood in its place. The old cabin was gone, leaving only memories, and the unsettling realization that someone had been living there in the shadows, patient and silent, long after everyone else had left. Even now, years later, I still feel it. Every time I hear a creak in an empty house or see movement just beyond the trees, I remember the farm, the cabin, and the man who had waited in the fields. Max is long gone, but the memory of that night and that quiet, relentless presence stays with me. A reminder of how vulnerable you are when the world is too quiet and the shadows are too patient. had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. After a long stretch of work in the city, I needed a break, some quiet, and my dog, Max, needed the wide open space more than I did. Max was a big German Shepherd mix, heavy on the fur and energy, and stubborn as hell, but loyal to the bone. We packed the truck early on a Friday morning, loaded with blankets, food, firewood, and a crate for Max, and headed into the mountains outside Bend, Oregon. The cabin I rented was small, tucked back from the dirt road by a mile or so, surrounded by dense pines and thick underbrush. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a loft, a stone fireplace, and a porch that creaked underfoot. But that was exactly what I wanted. Peace, isolation, no neighbors, no internet, just me, Max, and the wilderness. The drive up was uneventful. Max leaned his head on my shoulder for a while, then settled into the back seat, occasionally lifting his ears when a bird shrieked somewhere in the distance. I remember feeling the city stress melt out of me, slowly replaced by the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel and the smell of pine and wet earth. By late afternoon, we arrived. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Rustic, a little rundown, but inviting. After unloading, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and settled into a chair with Max at my feet. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a soft, constant whisper that felt oddly comforting. Max's ears twitched every now and then, but he seemed relaxed, eyes half closed. I stayed that way until night fell completely, painting the forest in deep shadows, the sky a solid black dotted with stars. Around 10, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I hugged my jacket tighter. Max was at my side, nose to the ground, sniffing everything. That's when I noticed it. A faint light moving through the trees, just far enough that it shouldn't be anyone coming to the cabin, but too close to be random. My stomach tightened. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was another hiker or someone on a nearby trail. But the movement was slow, calculated, almost cautious, and there were no other cabins anywhere near this one. The light stayed low, bobbing up and down as if held by a person moving carefully. I felt Max stiffen, growling softly, his hackles raised. That sound alone made my heart rate spike. I went back inside, closed the door, and checked the locks. Everything seemed fine. I kept Max close, keeping the fire going in the fireplace. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that whoever it was couldn't get in without making a lot of noise. But every little creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch outside, made me jump. Max never left my side, eyes scanning the window, ears straining for any unusual sound. Around midnight, it started raining. Hard. The kind of rain that smashes against the roof and runs down the windows in thick streaks. At first, I thought it would make the situation safer, thinking the rain would drive any potential intruder away. But then I noticed it, the scratching. Light, deliberate scratches on the wooden siding of the cabin, coming from the side facing the trees. I froze. Max growled low and sharp, teeth bared, his body tense, tail stiff. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and crept to the window. Rain dripped from the edges of the roof, but the beam of light cut through the darkness. Nothing, no person. But then I saw the marks on the wood, fresh scratches, deep, claw-like. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Something had been here or someone, and Max didn't like it. I tried to think rationally. Maybe a bear? But bears usually don't scratch like that, and Max would have been more vocal if it was a large animal outside. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure everything was secure. I gathered the knives from the kitchen, stacked chairs near the entrance, anything to make myself feel safer. The night stretched endlessly. Every small sound, the wind, rain, a branch breaking under the weight of water, set Max on alert. He growled at shadows, leapt to the door when he thought he heard movement. I sat with him, flashlight across my lap, waiting for sunrise, hoping that the storm outside would wash away whatever had been lurking. Around 3 a.m., it stopped raining. Silence fell, heavier than the storm. I heard it then, a low, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the mud, circling the cabin. Someone was walking slowly around us, close enough that I could hear the wet earth give under their weight, careful to avoid snapping twigs, careful not to be noticed. Max barked, loud and furious, a warning that made my heart leap to my throat. I grabbed my phone to call the sheriff, but there was no signal. The city's safety net didn't exist here. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched, hunted even, was intense. The flashlight flicked over a shadow between trees, too tall to be an animal. Then another. I realized we were surrounded, at least in the sense that the forest gave no easy path for someone to leave unseen. I did the only thing I could think of. I stayed inside, doors locked, Max at my side, and waited. I heard noises outside, branches snapping, soft footsteps, something scraping against the cabin again. Then it stopped as abruptly as it started. The silence was deafening. Hours passed. I dared not sleep. Max rested his head on my lap but never closed his eyes fully, alert to every tiny sound. When morning finally came, the rain had washed away most of the evidence. But I saw it. A set of footprints in the mud, circling the cabin, then disappearing back into the trees. Some of the wood panels on the side of the cabin were deeply scratched, splintered in places. Whatever or whoever it was had been careful, deliberate. I packed up as quickly as possible, not daring to leave anything behind. Max stayed close, alert, ears pointed in every direction. I drove down the dirt road without stopping, keeping my eyes on the treeline, expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, only the forest, silent and still. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was fully up. The fear had eased slightly, though my nerves were still raw. I called the sheriff to report the incident, but by then, all they could do was tell me no one had been reported in the area and to stay safe. Back home, I unpacked Max's crate and collapsed on the couch. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the night, the deliberate scratching, the footsteps in the mud. I knew I wouldn't go back. The isolation I had craved turned into something suffocating and dangerous. I've told myself it was probably someone doing some kind of scouting, maybe poachers or just people looking to scare campers. But the precision, the quiet, the way they circled the cabin like predators, it stuck with me. And Max? He never stopped staring at the windows that night, even weeks later. I could still feel the tension in his body, his instincts screaming a warning I almost wished I hadn't ignored. It was a lesson in respect, in paying attention, and in understanding that nature can be beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes humans can be just as dangerous as the wild around them. That weekend left me shaken, but alive. And I learned one thing. No matter how much you think you're prepared, you're never truly alone out there, not if someone or something is watching. It was the summer of 1998 when I got my seasonal assignment at Redwood Ridge National Park. I had just turned 22, fresh out of college, and eager to experience life in the backcountry. My job was simple in theory: maintain the park trails, monitor wildlife, and check on the smaller ranger cabins scattered across the forest. I was stationed at the Larkspur Cabin, a small, weathered building tucked deep into a secluded section of the park, about 2 miles from the nearest road. The first day I arrived, I remember trudging up the narrow dirt path, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil from the early morning mist. The trees were massive, old-growth redwoods, their trunks so wide it would take 3 men holding hands to encircle one. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. I'd been told the cabin hadn't been used heavily in the last few years, so I was prepared for it to be dusty and musty, but I hadn't expected the feeling that came over me when I stepped onto the creaking porch. The cabin itself was small, about 12 by 16 feet, with a single window facing the clearing and a crooked chimney that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. Inside, the furniture was sparse. A small metal cot with a thin mattress, a wooden table, and a chair. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, and a stack of firewood rested beside it. I set down my pack and ran my fingers over the rough-hewn walls. There was a faint smell of mildew, but otherwise it was exactly as I expected. Functional, simple, and quiet. I spent the first few hours unpacking and cleaning, sweeping the floor, dusting off the table, and stacking the firewood near the stove. Outside, the forest was alive with birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the occasional distant roar of a river cutting through the valley. By evening, I had a small fire going and sat on the cot, listening to the wind through the trees. I felt isolated, but not uncomfortable. It was quiet, yes, but peaceful. The next morning, I began my routine patrol. The park had recently seen an uptick in illegal logging, and my supervisor wanted extra eyes on the back trails. The day passed uneventfully, save for a few deer grazing near the creek. As the sun began to set, I headed back to the cabin, exhausted but content. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and the loose shutters. I wrapped myself in my blanket and tried to ignore the sound. The trouble began 2 nights later. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. Footsteps, not light padding, but slow, careful steps circling the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. The wind was calm now, but the shadows outside seemed to shift unnaturally. My first instinct was to convince myself it was an animal, but even in the darkness, I could see the outline of the clearing outside my window. Nothing. I tried to fall back asleep, but every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart race. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just nerves, maybe a raccoon or a deer again. I wrote it off in my notebook and continued my patrol. Over the next week, the occurrences became more frequent. I would hear heavy footsteps circling the cabin, sometimes stopping suddenly, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I could hear them. Once, I heard something dragging along the ground near the back door. I didn't open it to check. I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of knowing I was scared. I started keeping a loaded flare gun and a small hunting knife by the bed, just in case. The breaking point came on a rainy evening. The sky had turned a dull gray by mid-afternoon, and a steady drizzle began to fall. I was inside, writing up my weekly patrol report by candlelight because the cabin's old generator had given up, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, trying the door. The metal handle rattled violently, like someone was testing its strength. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the knife and crouched behind the table, listening. The door gave a few more violent shakes, then silence. Then, slowly, I heard the footsteps moving away into the dark forest. I could see the water dripping off the roof, the rain soaking into the clearing outside. I stayed in that position for hours, barely breathing, until the storm subsided and the first light of dawn appeared. That morning, I discovered footprints in the mud around the cabin. They were human, at least in size, but they weren't consistent. Some were large, others much smaller, as though more than one person had been there. And the strangest part, they ended abruptly at the treeline, as though whoever made them had disappeared into the forest itself. My logical mind wanted to chalk it up to hunters or poachers, but there were no roads nearby, and the forest was thick, nearly impossible to navigate without paths. I spent the rest of the week on high alert. I kept the stove burning at night, leaving a small light in the window, hoping it would deter anyone from approaching. I kept a journal of every noise, every shadow, every movement outside. But still, there was no one to see, no one to confront. Just the creeping, omnipresent feeling of being watched. On the final night of my assignment, a dense fog rolled in, hugging the forest floor and the cabin like a suffocating blanket. I lit the stove and stacked firewood as the light from the small window reflected off the fog, creating long, distorted shadows. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie silence. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. Heavy, slow, deliberate. This time, I didn't hide. I opened the window slightly and shined a flashlight into the fog. I saw nothing, but then, in the mist, I noticed movement. Glimpses of shadows slipping between the trees, too fast and deliberate to be animals. I could hear branches snapping under heavy weight. My heart raced, but I remembered all my training. Stay calm, don't show fear, and keep your position. I stayed at the window until the first light of dawn, watching the fog dissipate, hoping whatever it was had gone. When morning finally arrived, I packed up quickly. My supervisor had a truck waiting at the edge of the park to take me back. As I walked toward it, I glanced back at the cabin. The air was still damp, the ground muddy, but the forest seemed calm again, almost normal. I didn't see anyone or anything, just the quiet, dense woods stretching in every direction. Later, back at the ranger station, I told my story to my colleagues. Some believed me, others smiled politely and chalked it up to the isolation and my imagination. But I knew what I had experienced. The cabin had felt watched, intruded upon, and every instinct told me that it wasn't random hikers or deer. Whatever it was, it had stayed hidden, patient, and silent. Years later, I returned to Redwood Ridge, this time on a guided tour, far from Larkspur Cabin. I asked about the backcountry trails, and the older rangers mentioned the cabin, long abandoned now, not used since the late 90s. They said some people reported strange sounds, heavy footsteps, and sudden disturbances in the area. They never found anyone, and no evidence remained. I still think about that assignment sometimes, the weight of the silence, the fog, and the shadows moving in ways no human or animal should. But I also think about the lessons I learned, to trust my instincts, to respect the forest, and to remember that sometimes the world doesn't make sense. Not because it's supernatural, but because it's bigger, wilder, and more unpredictable than any of us are prepared for. I left that place alive, cautious, and profoundly aware of how small and vulnerable we are when we step into the deep, quiet wild. The cabin still stands, weathered and alone. No one uses it anymore, and I hope, for the sake of anyone who might stumble upon it in the future, that they are as careful and alert as I had to be. Because the forest doesn't need ghosts or fairy tales to be terrifying. It's terrifying enough on its own. I never thought building a cabin in the middle of the woods would be something I'd actually do. But there I was, in the fall of 2003 in northern Vermont, a 30-year-old man with more stubbornness than experience, attempting to create a small shelter from the harsh wilderness. I'd always been drawn to solitude, to being surrounded by pine and birch, and when I found a small plot of land near a forgotten logging road, I couldn't resist. The idea was simple: a tiny cabin, enough to survive a few days at a time, a place to disconnect from everything. I didn't expect the weather to turn against me as soon as it did. I had been working on the cabin for 3 weeks straight. My hands were rough, blistered, and constantly smeared with sawdust and mud. The frame was mostly up, walls half-sheathed with pine boards I'd scavenged from old pallets and discarded planks left by loggers. The roof was still just a skeleton of rafters, and the tarp I had stretched over it barely kept the rain out. That evening, A storm rolled in faster than I expected. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, clouds racing like they were trying to outrun themselves. The wind tore through the young trees around me, bending them violently, and the first fat drops of rain started hitting the tarp with a solid thump. I worked quickly, hammering in boards while the wind tried to wrest them from my grasp. The air smelled of wet pine and dirt, heavy and alive. The rain came harder, relentless, hammering down in sheets, soaking me instantly through my jacket. I realized the storm wasn't just a passing drizzle. It was one of those sudden, fierce northeastern tempests, the kind that made even seasoned woodsmen uncomfortable. By the time I managed to secure the last wall plank, the light had faded entirely. The woods around me became a shifting mass of dark shapes, swaying violently in the wind. Every branch snapping in the storm sounded louder than it should have. I stopped for a moment, leaning on my hammer, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed it. The sound of movement that wasn't the wind. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch, or maybe a deer panicking in the storm, but the rustling was deliberate. There was a pattern, a rhythm, almost like something or someone was pacing just beyond the treeline. I froze, listening. Rain pelted my face and the earth beneath my boots turned to slippery mud, but I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I also knew the cabin was the only shelter in this storm. I hurried inside, mud tracking across the bare wooden floor. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and sawdust. I shoved my wet jacket onto a makeshift hook and lit the small lantern I had brought. Its flame flickered, casting shadows across the walls, making the room seem alive, threatening. The wind howled, rattling the frame of the cabin. My chest was tight with tension, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape. I sat down heavily on a plank I was planning to use for a bench, and for a moment I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was probably just an animal, or the wind making things sound bigger than they were. The storm didn't let up. The rain struck the tarp above me like a drum, and the wind bent the cabin, making the walls groan in protest. I realized I hadn't completely secured the roof. Water was dripping through in small streams, soaking my boots again. My mind raced with all the things that could go wrong. What if a tree fell? What if the wind tore the tarp away and the structure collapsed? And that rustling outside, if it wasn't just an animal, I had no way to defend myself. I'd left my tools outside in the mud. My only potential weapons a hammer and a small hatchet I kept near my bedroll. Then I heard it clearly. A low, dragging sound, like something big moving across the wet leaves, inching closer to the cabin. My hands gripped the hammer until my knuckles whitened. My eyes darted to every shadow, every corner of the walls. I could see the outline of the tarp shifting violently. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but my chest hurt from the effort of staying still, from the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The sound didn't get any closer, but it didn't leave either. I tried to listen for patterns, for anything that would tell me it was just an animal, but everything in the storm was distorted, magnified. I remembered that my grandfather had once told me that fear could make ordinary things monstrous. I repeated it in my head, like a mantra. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense of presence, a living weight just beyond the walls. I decided to act. Slowly, I moved to the door, lifted the flap of the tarp, and peered into the storm. The rain hit my face like needles, and I had to squint to see anything beyond the blurred shapes of trees. And then I saw it. A large deer, soaked and shaking, dragging one of its legs as it tried to move through the mud. Relief flooded me so quickly it almost made me laugh. All this fear over a crippled animal. Its eyes reflected the dim light from my lantern through the wet night, wide with panic. I watched as it struggled to make its way up the slope behind the cabin, slipping and sliding until it disappeared into the woods. I let out a long, shuddering breath. My body felt like it had been in a vice. I looked around the cabin, at the dripping walls, the unstable roof, and realized I had to secure it properly if I was going to survive the night. The storm was still fierce, but I moved methodically, nailing down loose boards, tightening ropes, reinforcing the corners. The rain had slowed slightly by dawn, and when I finally stepped outside, the forest looked different. The storm had stripped the leaves off smaller branches. The ground was churned to mud, and the smell of wet earth and pine was overwhelming. Exhausted, I sat on a fallen log and looked at my cabin. It was crude, imperfect, but standing. I thought about how small I felt in that forest, how easy it was for nature to remind me that I wasn't in control. But I also felt a surge of accomplishment. I had survived a night I hadn't been prepared for, faced fear and isolation head-on, and I had made a shelter that could protect me. The storm had tested me, shown me my weaknesses, and yet I had endured. Over the next days, I reinforced the cabin properly, adding a sturdier roof and a small stone fireplace for warmth. I built a small path down to the creek nearby, cut away dangerous trees, and gradually, the forest became less threatening. That night, though, the memory of the storm never left me. The way the wind could make walls creak like they were alive, the way shadows moved with intent, the sound of life outside the cabin that I couldn't quite understand. It was humbling. By the end of the week, I felt more capable than I had in years. I had learned to respect the forest, to plan for its unpredictability, and most importantly, to face fear without letting it paralyze me. The cabin wasn't just a place to sleep. It was proof that even in the middle of chaos, with rain, wind, and darkness pressing in, you could carve out a little space to survive, to endure, and to emerge stronger. I had built more than a cabin. I had built confidence, resilience, and a small refuge against the wild world outside. I never thought I'd end up staying in a cabin near an old graveyard, but that fall of 1998, I didn't have much choice. I was 24, fresh out of college, and trying to save money while working odd jobs in northern Vermont. My car had broken down during a rainstorm on a back road near the town of Barton, and the only place I could find shelter was a tiny, weathered cabin perched at the edge of a small cemetery. The wooden structure looked abandoned, its paint peeling and windows grimy with years of dirt and dust. A narrow dirt path wound from the road past crooked tombstones, their inscriptions mostly worn away, leading right up to the cabin. The moment I opened the cabin door, the smell hit me. Wet wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old iron. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the dim light streaming through the thin curtains. The furniture was sparse. A rickety wooden table, a couple of folding chairs, a small cot in the corner with a thin, gray mattress that looked like it had been through decades of winters. I didn't care. I was cold, tired, and soaked from the rain. After shutting the door, I explored a little. The cabin had one small stove with an empty firebox, a sink with rusty plumbing, and a tiny kitchen counter with cracked tiles. The shelves were bare except for a few dusty jars with unrecognizable labels. I noticed a small, iron-bound chest tucked under the table, but it was locked, and I didn't bother trying to open it. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with the faint odor of decaying leaves from the graveyard. I tried to shake off the unease that settled over me as I set my bag down. I lit a small candle I found on the windowsill and ate the meager lunch I had in my backpack. Outside, the gravestones were barely visible through the mist. Most were small, old markers, some leaning, some broken. A few newer stones suggested that the cemetery was still in use, but there was no sign of anyone else. I had passed several of these markers on the way up from the road, reading names like E. Harlow, 1874 to 1910, or M. Dyer, 1922 to 1947. Something about their faded letters made the silence feel heavier. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. The wind pushed through gaps in the wooden walls, making them groan and shiver. I tried to focus on reading a small paperback I had in my bag, but the sounds outside kept pulling my attention. The branches of the trees scraped against the windows like fingernails, and I thought I could hear footsteps crunching on the gravel path beyond the clearing. I convinced myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, every now and then, the sound seemed closer, deliberate. Around midnight, the cabin's darkness felt suffocating. The candle I had lit flickered and went out, leaving me in near total blackness. I could hear the wind rushing through the cemetery, stirring the old leaves and debris among the stones. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground. I froze. The noise was coming from outside, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded, but I didn't make a sound. I remembered the stories of people burying valuables or even bodies in isolated cemeteries, though I tried not to think about it. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the mist, revealing the gravestones and the edge of the tree line. Nothing moved. The wind carried the faint smell of wet soil and rotting leaves, but nothing else. I told myself it was the wind or an animal, but the scraping sound returned a few minutes later, louder and closer, almost at the cabin's edge. I had a small pocket knife in my pocket, and I held it tightly, ready for whatever might come. The scraping continued intermittently, moving around the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. Then I noticed something on the ground just outside the door. A long, deep scratch across the dirt, like someone had used a heavy stick to mark the earth. The pattern was too straight, too precise to be random. I swallowed hard and decided I couldn't stay in the cabin all night. I needed to get out. I remembered the back road that led to the main street of Barton was about a mile away, but in the dark and rain, it would be treacherous. I decided to wait until first light. I fortified the door as best I could with a chair, then sat on the cot, flashlight in hand, watching the windows. My ears strained to hear anything unusual, my mind racing with what could be out there. Every time the wind rattled the cabin walls or a branch tapped the roof, I flinched. The night was long and sleep didn't come. Around 3 a.m., I heard the scraping again, louder this time, circling the cabin slowly. Then a low thump against the door made me jump. Whoever or whatever it was trying to get in. My hands shook as I held the knife, and I realized I had to make a choice. Stay and wait for dawn, or risk running through the darkness to the road. When the first light of morning began to seep through the mist, I made my move. I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back window, careful to avoid the gravestones. The ground was slick with mud, and my feet sank into the soft soil. I ran as fast as I could, over roots and rocks, toward the faint outline of the road through the fog. I didn't look back. The scraping and thumping stopped almost immediately once I left the clearing, but I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, where the morning sun had started to burn away the mist. When I finally saw a car approaching from the distance, I waved frantically. The driver slowed, and I jumped in, shaking and covered in mud. I didn't speak much, only pointed back toward the cemetery. The driver gave me a strange look but didn't ask questions. I realized then that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't identify. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I learned that it had been abandoned for decades, and the graveyard was part of an old family plot that no one tended to anymore. Some locals said the place was cursed, that vandals or scavengers sometimes used the cabin as shelter, but nothing ever explained the deliberate marks in the soil or the sounds I heard that night. I never stayed anywhere near a cemetery again, and I always made sure my car was in good shape before traveling. Even now, more than 25 years later, I remember the cold, the dark, and the sound of something moving just outside the window. The image of that small cabin at the edge of the graveyard, and the feeling of being watched and trapped, is burned into my memory. I'm glad I got away, but a part of me will never forget how close I came to becoming just another story tied to that old, forgotten cemetery. I didn't expect my little getaway to turn into a nightmare. It was the summer of 2013, and I had just turned 34. After years of working endless shifts in a Chicago office, I needed something quiet, something far away from the noise, the people, the constant hum of the city. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin in the woods of northern Minnesota. Not the touristy areas near Lake Superior, but deeper in a forest so dense that the trees seemed to swallow the sunlight before it even reached the ground. I drove up the winding dirt road in my old Ford Ranger, the one I had bought used 5 years prior. Dust clung to the paint, and the tires kicked up a steady trail as I went. The GPS barely worked, and by the time I arrived, the sun was just dipping below the thick canopy. The cabin was exactly what I wanted. Rustic, 2 small rooms, a wood stove, and a creaky front porch with a view of a small clearing where wildflowers struggled against the shade. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something faintly metallic I didn't recognize. I unpacked slowly, making sure everything was in its place, then lit the stove and sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, listening to the forest. The quiet wasn't soft. It was almost physical, pressing against my ears, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird calling somewhere deep in the trees. My dog, a 6-year-old German Shepherd named Max, padded around the porch, sniffing the edges of the cabin, his ears perked and tail stiff. He had always been a good judge of trouble, and at first he seemed content. The first night was fine, more peaceful than I could have imagined. I slept with the windows open slightly, the night air cool on my face. But in the middle of the night, I woke to Max growling low in his throat. I froze. The sound came from just outside the cabin. My heart picked up. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal passing by. But Max didn't usually growl at deer. He stood at the edge of the porch, hackles raised, staring into the woods. The next morning, I explored a bit. There was a faint trail leading through the trees, almost invisible except for the trampled grass and the way the sunlight hit the forest floor. I followed it for maybe half a mile, Max leading the way, nose to the ground. I came to a small creek, water dark and cold, running over moss-covered rocks. Everything seemed normal. Still, there was a strange tension in the air, a sense that the forest itself was watching. That afternoon, while chopping firewood, I noticed something odd. The pile I had stacked neatly at the side of the cabin looked disturbed. Some logs were shifted, one even rolled a few feet away. I thought maybe Max had been at it, but he wasn't capable of moving logs that heavy. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. The second night was worse. Max barked at the edge of the clearing, sharp and frantic. I got up to check, flashlight in hand. Nothing, just the trees swaying lightly in the wind. I stayed outside for a while, scanning the darkness, and then I saw it, or at least I thought I did. Something moving between the trees, too fast to make out, but deliberate. My pulse jumped. I tried calling it out, but my voice sounded small and weak against the massive forest. Max growled again, closer this time, then backed up to my side. That's when I realized, whatever it was close enough to hear me. I spent the next day trying to rationalize it. There was no one else around for miles. The nearest house was a 20-minute drive down a gravel road. No one would be here, and yet the sense of being watched didn't go away. I set up makeshift defenses. A few knives within reach, the rifle I had brought leaning against the wall, ready. Max stayed close, never leaving my side, and I began double-checking the locks on the cabin door and windows, even though the cabin was small and rustic. On the third night, I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't of movement in the woods. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I sat in the dark, barely breathing, listening. Max's growl was low but constant now, vibrating through the floorboards. I thought about calling the sheriff, but the cell service was patchy, and I didn't want to admit that I had possibly trapped myself in the middle of nowhere with someone, or something, stalking me. Morning never felt so welcome. I made a plan. I would hike back to the main road and drive to the nearest town, get help, and return with authorities. I packed a bag quietly, keeping Max close, and started down the trail. But the forest had changed overnight. Branches were broken, some of the smaller trees bent in unnatural ways. Whoever or whatever had been here had left signs. I pushed forward anyway, determined. Halfway to the road, I found footprints. Large, heavy boots, not like mine or Max's paw prints. And then I heard it behind me, a low, deliberate cracking of sticks. I froze. Max's hackles raised, his growl turning into a bark, loud and threatening. I started running. The trail, familiar in daylight yesterday, twisted in ways I didn't remember, the underbrush catching at my legs. I could hear the footsteps behind me, keeping pace, but not close enough to see. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I reached the road as dusk was falling. Headlights appeared in the distance. I ran toward them, waving my arms like a madman. The vehicle slowed, a pickup truck, and I jumped onto the side of the road, breathless, covered in dirt and scratches from the underbrush. The man inside, local I guessed from his worn hat and sun-darkened skin, didn't ask questions. He saw Max, saw my state, and just nodded. "Get in," he said. "You're lucky I was driving by." We drove back to town. Max huddled in my lap, ears flat, eyes wide. I explained as best I could, but the man just shook his head. "Not the first person to get nervous out there," he said. "Some folks don't ever come back once they see they're not alone." The sheriff's office came with flashlights and radios later that night. They searched the forest around the cabin. No one was found, but the footprints remained, larger than a man's boot, heavy, pressing into the soil as if whoever had made them had weight beyond normal. The logs I had stacked at the cabin were all overturned again. The sheriff said it could have been anyone, but after years in the area, he had learned that the forest could hide people, and some of them stayed hidden for days, even weeks. He warned me never to return alone. I didn't. The cabin was rented out again after that summer, but I never went back. Max and I stayed close that night in my apartment back in Chicago, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us all along. That cabin, those woods, the sense of being hunted, stuck with me for years. I could still smell the wet pine, hear the snapping of distant twigs in the dark. I learned something important that summer. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the living, hidden in plain sight, patient, and watching. I've gone on other trips since then, always with Max, always with cell service, always with more people around. I never forgot the look in his eyes that night, the way he pressed against my legs, knowing something was out there that wanted to find us. That cabin in Minnesota, that summer in 2013, left a mark I carry even now, over a decade later. It was the fall of 2014 when I first stepped onto the gravel drive leading to the cabin. The forest around it was dense, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until every footstep sounds like a shout. I was 32 at the time, freshly divorced, and the cabin had once belonged to my ex-husband, Mark. He had inherited it from his father years ago, a small, wood-clad structure tucked into a hollow beside a slow creek. I had never cared much about the place while we were together, but after the divorce, a strange pull drew me back. I told myself it was for closure, but deep down I think I wanted to see the remnants of the life we'd almost built, the skeletons of promises that hadn't been kept. The cabin was a two-story structure, rough around the edges, with dark stains on the logs from decades of rain and wind. The porch sagged slightly, the boards creaking under each step. I parked my car at the edge of the gravel and stepped down, feeling the chill of the October air seep through my coat. The wind whistled through the pines like distant voices, and the creek beside the cabin gurgled quietly, almost like it was holding its breath. I noticed the windows were dirty, streaked with grime and spiderwebs, and the lock on the front door had been twisted and warped over the years. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, mildew, and a faint metallic tang. Dust covered every surface, settling like a thin layer of ash. The living room was small, with a stone fireplace that had once been the heart of the place. I ran my hand along the mantel and felt the roughness of the stone, the chips and cracks that spoke of years of fires that had warmed, but never healed, the space. The furniture was gone, leaving only bare floorboards that groaned under my weight. Sunlight filtered in through the grimy windows, painting streaks of orange and brown across the floor. I moved into the kitchen. The cabinets hung slightly crooked, doors missing, the sink full of rust stains. I could picture Mark here, leaning against the counter, smoking a cigarette, muttering to himself about bills or work or whatever had kept him awake at night. The thought made my stomach knot, a mixture of memories and the uncanny feeling of being somewhere that had once been shared, now emptied of life. I decided to check the bedrooms upstairs. The stairs creaked alarmingly, the wood thin and worn. Each step felt like it might give way, but it held. Upstairs, the bedrooms were smaller than I remembered, the walls lined with old wallpaper peeling at the corners. I opened the first door and found nothing but dust and broken curtain rods. The second bedroom had more signs of decay: a cracked mirror, a rusted radiator, a stain on the floor that looked like it had once been water or something worse. It was then, as I stood there in the quiet, that I felt it, the sense of being watched. Not in a playful, spooky way, but in the instinctive pit-in-your-stomach way you feel when you are somewhere you shouldn't be alone. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just the wind, the creaking floorboards, or my imagination. I moved back down to the living room and sat on the edge of the fireplace hearth, staring at the empty room, trying to ground myself. By the time evening came, the light had faded to a grayish blue, and shadows stretched across the floor like reaching fingers. I lit a lantern I had brought from the car, and its soft glow painted the room in warm, flickering light. That's when I first heard the knocks. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches brushing against the cabin siding. But then it came again, more deliberate. 3 short knocks, paused, 2 long ones. They didn't sound random. They sounded like someone was on the porch. My heart hammered. I told myself to stay calm, that it was probably just an animal. But the knocks continued, irregular now, moving from the porch to the side of the cabin. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon had found a hollow in the siding. But the sound was too heavy, too precise to be just an animal. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if someone or something was testing me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and crept to the front door, my hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. Peering through the grimy window, I saw nothing but the darkness of the forest, the swaying branches, and the faint glint of the creek under the moonlight. I told myself again it was nothing, forced my muscles to relax, and went back to the hearth. Then I heard it, the floorboards above me, creaking softly. Someone was walking upstairs. I froze, the lantern shaking slightly in my grip. My first instinct was to run, but the stairs were behind me, and in the dim light I would have tripped for sure. I grabbed the heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen counter, gripping it like a weapon, and whispered to myself that I was imagining things. But the steps grew louder, deliberate, slow. I edged toward the stairs, each movement careful and deliberate. At the top, the sound stopped. I shined my flashlight into the hallway. Nothing. The bedroom stared back at me, empty, still, silent. My pulse was roaring in my ears. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the floor in the living room, the lantern flickering, listening to every whisper of the wind, every rustle of the trees. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Morning came in a gray haze. The sun barely pierced the canopy, and the forest looked like it had been holding its breath overnight. I decided to leave. I wanted to pack up, sell the cabin, or at least never come back. As I stepped out onto the porch, I froze. The marks in the dirt, heavy footprints, big enough to be a man's, leading from the treeline to the porch and stopping right at the door. I didn't wait. I ran to my car, my hands shaking, my breath visible in the cold morning air. When I looked back once, I saw the cabin sitting there, quiet again, almost innocent under the weak light. But the footprints were gone. No one could explain it, and I didn't care. I drove off the gravel road without looking back, the forest swallowing the cabin behind me. Years later, I would sometimes dream of the cabin, the scratches in the wood, the knocks, the creaking floorboards, all vivid in my mind. But the strangest part, the part one still think about sometimes, was the certainty that I hadn't been alone that night. Whoever or whatever had been there hadn't made a sound outside the floorboards. It hadn't needed to. It had been patient, waiting, and I had been just foolish enough to be in its space. Eventually, I sold the land. I couldn't bring myself to keep it, couldn't face going back. But sometimes, when the wind whistles through the trees or I pass a small creek in a forest, I feel that same tension in my stomach, the reminder that some places are not meant for people. Not because they're haunted, not because of ghosts, but because they belong to something else entirely. Something that watches, waits, and doesn't care who you are. I've never forgotten that cabin, and I never will. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a week alone at a small cabin I had rented in rural Vermont. I was 31 at the time, burned out from the constant grind of my job in Boston, and I wanted the silence, the isolation, the kind of solitude that would make me forget the noise of the world. The cabin was tucked away in a narrow valley, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. The road leading to it was more of a dirt track than anything else, and by the time I reached it, my little hatchback had a layer of red dust clinging to the tires. The cabin itself was old, built from pine logs that had darkened over the decades. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and a small stone chimney promised warmth if I could manage to get the fire going. There was a porch with a rickety railing that creaked under even the lightest weight, and a wooden swing that swayed in the wind even though I hadn't touched it. I had brought my dog, Jasper, a medium-sized mixed breed with a shaggy coat and the kind of loyalty that made him my constant companion. He padded beside me as we unloaded my bags, sniffing every corner of the cabin as though he were already aware of its history. The first day was peaceful. I chopped wood for the stove, swept the dust from the floors, and unpacked my few belongings. The forest surrounding the cabin was alive with the sounds of autumn, the rustling of leaves, the distant caw of crows, and the faint trickle of a stream nearby. Jasper occasionally barked at small animals, and I would watch him from the window as he trotted through the tall grass. That night, I had a fire going in the stove, its orange glow pushing back the shadows that pooled in the corners of the cabin. The wind outside rattled the window panes, and Jasper lay curled at my feet, snoring softly. I felt, for the first time in years, a sense of real peace. It wasn't until the second night that the unease began. I woke around 2 in the morning, Not from any specific sound, but from a sensation, the feeling that I wasn't alone. Jasper was up too, ears perked and body tense. I listened closely and realized that the sound was coming from outside. A faint scraping, like someone dragging a heavy object across the dirt road that led to the cabin. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind or a deer, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the silence afterward was heavier, almost suffocating. I lay awake until dawn, the fire in the stove dwindling to embers, and every crack of the wooden walls made me start. During the day, I tried to shake it off, telling myself that the countryside had its own noises, especially in autumn when animals were preparing for winter. I went for a long walk with Jasper, keeping to the trail that led deeper into the woods. I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud that hadn't been there the day before, but they were narrow, like from a small ATV. I didn't think much of it, assuming some local hunters were about. Still, I felt watched. At one point, Jasper stopped abruptly, hair standing on end, and growled low in his throat, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of eyes on us was undeniable. That evening, I double-checked the locks on the cabin door and windows. I kept the fire going longer, just in case, and tried to read to keep my mind occupied. Around midnight, the scraping started again, louder this time, closer. Jasper barked furiously, and I grabbed a flashlight and the old hunting rifle I had brought, even though I had no real intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The sound circled the cabin. I could hear the crunch of dirt and leaves, slow and deliberate, always moving just out of the light of the porch. My heart was pounding, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt fear. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every movement. By morning, the tracks around the cabin were clear. Footprints, boots larger than mine, muddied and heavy, as if someone had paced back and forth, testing the area. I didn't see anyone, but Jasper refused to go outside without me. I decided then that I couldn't stay another night without knowing what I was dealing with. The following day, I packed a small bag with essentials, leaving most of my things in the cabin, planning to hike back to the main road and drive back to town. But before I left, I took one last look at the tracks. They were deeper now, leading into the forest behind the cabin. The sense of being watched didn't let up, and I noticed that the swing on the porch, which had been still all day, now creaked slightly as if someone had been sitting on it. I didn't dare stay to investigate. I called the local ranger station from my cell phone. A weak signal, but it worked. I explained that I felt unsafe and would be coming down the trail. They said someone could meet me at the road. I left the cabin quickly, Jasper at my heels, the autumn forest seeming more menacing than ever. The trees, beautiful in daylight, cast long shadows that made the path look like it was alive. Every branch that cracked under my boots sounded like someone stepping behind me. By the time I reached the main road, a small pickup truck appeared, lights cutting through the early evening gloom. The ranger, a woman in her 40s named Linda, was calm but serious when she saw me. She looked at the tracks, and her expression tightened. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "People have been reporting someone or something watching the cabins up here. Could be a trespasser, could be worse. But you're safe now." I didn't ask for details. I was too relieved to be leaving. They drove me back to the nearest town, and I watched the cabin disappear behind the dense trees, a little log structure that had seemed so peaceful just days before. I never returned to that part of the forest. I later learned from local news that there had been a series of break-ins in the area, mostly targeting cabins that were unoccupied or rented to tourists. No one was caught, and many of the perpetrators were never identified. That experience stayed with me for years. I still visit the countryside occasionally, but I make sure never to be alone in an isolated cabin. Jasper stayed with me until he passed, and I often think of that night when his instincts kept me alive. The fear I felt wasn't from ghosts or fairy tales. It was real, the kind that comes from knowing someone else could be out there, just watching, and you're completely at their mercy. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint scraping in the dirt, the creak of the swing in the wind, and Jasper's low growl as he stared into the dark forest. But I also remember the relief of daylight, the sight of the ranger's truck coming over the hill, and the feeling of finally walking away with him beside me, safe at last. That night taught me the value of vigilance, of trusting instincts, and the importance of never underestimating the unknown dangers in the seemingly quiet corners of the world. It was late October in 2012 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 32 then, burned out from the relentless pace of my job as a software engineer and craving silence, a space where the hum of traffic and the constant pinging of emails couldn't reach me. I had found a small cabin for rent deep in the Adirondacks, a place so remote that cell signal didn't exist. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, nothing but trees, dirt roads, and the slow rhythm of nature. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived just as the sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The cabin itself was small, maybe 600 square feet, made of rough timber, and looked decades old, but sturdy. It had a single bedroom, a small living room with a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with a leaking faucet. Outside, a thin layer of fog was already starting to creep along the forest floor. My dog, Max, a 5-year-old black lab, sniffed around the edges of the porch, his ears perked up, muscles tense. The first night was unnerving but not frightening. There were the usual forest sounds, owls hooting in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves, but no one around, and the air was too still for anything to break the silence. I built a fire in the stove, stacked what I had found in the shed, and cooked some canned soup. Max curled up next to me, occasionally glancing toward the windows as if he could sense something I couldn't. I went to bed early, too tired from the drive and the long hike from the main road to the cabin, where my car could go no further. The next day, I decided to explore. There was a small trail leading deeper into the woods, and I wanted to see how far I could go before getting lost. Max was ecstatic, bounding ahead and then circling back, constantly checking that I was following. The trail wound up a hill, and I could see the tops of the trees glowing gold in the autumn sun. It felt like I was walking through a painting, a perfect, quiet world, until I realized that I hadn't seen another soul all morning. Not one hiker, not one camper, no one. By mid-afternoon, I started feeling a twinge of unease. The woods were beautiful but strangely oppressive. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves like whispers, and the trail ahead seemed to narrow until it was almost impassable. I noticed broken branches and claw marks on the trees, probably from deer or bears, I thought, but there was something about the spacing of the scratches that felt deliberate, too high for an animal. I decided to turn back. That evening, as I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door, which I had locked that morning, was slightly ajar. I had a set of keys and I was sure I had latched it. My heart raced. Max growled softly, low in his throat, his body stiff. I stepped inside, cautiously, scanning the room. Nothing seemed disturbed. The kitchen was the same, the firewood untouched. The only thing out of place was a single muddy footprint on the floor by the door. I froze, staring at it. Whoever or whatever had come in hadn't taken anything. I spent the night on edge, sitting by the stove with a baseball bat I kept by the bed. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind against the walls, the creak of the floorboards, the distant crack of a branch breaking. Max refused to leave my side, shifting constantly, ears forward, eyes darting to every shadow. I didn't sleep much, The next morning, I went to check the perimeter. There were more footprints outside now, scattered in no clear direction. They were large, heavy boots, and whoever had been here had circled the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. I called the local ranger station, but with no cell signal, I had to hike to a small outpost about 3 miles away. The ranger I spoke to was skeptical but advised me to leave if I felt unsafe. I promised I would. That afternoon, I began packing, though a storm had started to roll in, dark clouds covering the sun, making everything feel gray and tight. I packed slowly, checking the cabin repeatedly. By the time I was ready to leave, the rain had begun. A heavy, steady downpour that turned the dirt road into a slick track of mud. I called a local taxi service, and the driver agreed to come get me, though he warned me that roads could get treacherous in the storm. While waiting, I decided to clean up one last time. That's when I noticed something behind the shed. A small pile of branches had been arranged in a crude shape, almost like a chair, and at its base, there was an old, rusted can with a single note inside. I picked it up carefully, squinting through the rain. The note read, "Leave before dark." No name, no date, just that. My stomach turned. Whoever had been lurking had been watching me for days, maybe from the trees, waiting for the storm to trap me here. I didn't wait any longer. Max and I sprinted back toward the car, slipping in the mud, soaked to the bone. The taxi arrived just as night fell, headlights cutting through the pouring rain. I climbed in, shivering, heart hammering, and didn't look back as the cabin disappeared behind the trees. When I finally got back to town, I called the local authorities, gave them the cabin's location, and explained the footprints, the note, everything. They said they would check it out, but with no solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Weeks later, I read in the local paper that a man had been arrested for squatting in abandoned cabins in the area, and he had a history of watching hikers and renters before leaving cryptic warnings. I didn't know if he had been the one at my cabin, but it was enough to feel a sense of closure. Even now, years later, I remember the smell of wet pine and earth, the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof, Max's low growl in the darkness, and that single muddy footprint. I never returned to that part of the Adirondacks, but I also carry a strange sense of gratitude for Max's instincts, for the fact that I listened to them, and for the warning that saved me. That cabin could have been the end of a story I didn't want to be part of, but instead, it became a memory, sharp and vivid, a reminder that even in the most beautiful isolation, danger can hide in plain sight. I was 32 at the time, and I had decided to take a break from my life in Denver. My work as a freelance photojournalist had been draining me for months. Stories about crime and accidents had become routine, and I felt like I'd lost touch with the simple part of myself that used to notice sunsets or the way rain sounds on a roof. I rented a small cabin in northern Montana, about 20 miles from the nearest town, a place I found online through a small property rental site. It was isolated, but that's what I wanted. A chance to be alone, to breathe, to hear the wind in the pines instead of sirens. The cabin itself was modest. One story, built from aged logs, with a slanted roof and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The furniture was rough but serviceable. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small bed pushed against one wall, and a kitchen counter with a tiny sink and a gas stove. There was no internet, no cell service, and electricity came from a generator that the owner said could run for about 12 hours a day. Perfect. The first night, I unpacked my camera equipment, stacked firewood beside the cabin, and lit a small fire in the fireplace. The wind outside was sharp, making the walls creak and the pine trees slap against each other. I remember thinking it was the perfect soundtrack for being alone, but it was also the kind of quiet that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. On the second day, I decided to hike a little. The land behind the cabin was a mix of dense forest and small hills. I kept my pack light with water, a knife, and a flashlight. I had only been walking for about an hour when I noticed something odd. A faint set of tire tracks on a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone had been here recently. I brushed it off. Probably a ranger or a local farmer checking their land. Still, a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. That night, around 10, I was stirring the fire when I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate walking just beyond the small clearing around the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Bears or deer could make a lot of noise. But then came a subtle thud, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to another. Careful not to make too much noise, but heavy enough that it wasn't a deer. I froze. My mind raced through scenarios, none of them comforting. I didn't have a gun, only a knife I kept in my backpack. I grabbed my camera for some kind of protection, a laughable idea now, but at least it made me feel less helpless. The wind was gusting, and the shadows of the pines fell across the cabin walls in long, jagged shapes. The footsteps stopped. Then, slowly, I heard scraping against the cabin wall. Whoever it was, they were outside my window, brushing against the siding, probably trying to see inside. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake the dead. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat in the dark corner, eyes straining to see the shadows through the glass. Time stretched, 15 minutes, maybe more. Finally, the sound of a vehicle starting far down the dirt road. A truck, old and rusty, slowly pulling away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire low and listened to every creak, every snap of branches, imagining the person circling back, hiding in the trees, waiting for a chance to come inside. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints, too large and heavy to be mine, pressed into the soft ground around the cabin. They hadn't gone far. My stomach turned. Whoever had been outside had stayed close, watched me, and left without a sound once they saw the fire was burning. I debated leaving immediately, but I didn't want to admit defeat. I spent the next 2 days securing the cabin. I piled firewood near the windows, shoved heavy chairs against the doors, and kept my knife on the table. Every shadow felt like movement. Every crack of a branch sounded like someone walking. I stayed inside as much as possible, only leaving briefly to gather water or to stretch my legs. On the fourth night, the encounter escalated. Around 9, I heard voices outside, low, muffled, almost impossible to make out. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. One voice was deep, gravelly, and it seemed like it was calling out something I couldn't understand. Another was lighter, maybe younger. Whoever they were moving closer. I could hear breathing now, uneven, sharp. They were right outside. Panic hit me like a wave. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight, and when I shone it out the window, I saw movement. A shadow flitted between the trees. The truck from before was parked in the distance. Then I saw it. A figure crouched low, holding something that glinted in the firelight. A gun. My throat went dry. I knew I had 2 choices. Stay inside and hope they didn't break in or try to get out. I chose the latter. I grabbed my pack, my camera, and quietly opened the back door. The fire was low, and the shadows hid me. I ran through the trees, sticking to shadows, moving as fast as I could without making noise. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. The truck started its engine again, and I could hear it moving slowly behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until the dirt road reappeared. Then I sprinted toward it, waving my arms desperately, hoping a car would come by. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared around a bend. I waved frantically. The driver slowed and stopped. I jumped in the passenger seat, coughing and trembling. I told the driver to drive fast, and they didn't ask questions, just nodded and sped toward the town. Back in town, safe in a small motel room, I called the local sheriff and explained everything. They took my statement seriously. Apparently, there had been a string of cabin break-ins in that area over the last month, targeting people who stayed alone. Some had been burglarized, but a few people had been threatened or injured. My encounter could have ended much worse. I stayed in the motel for 2 more nights, resting, too shaken to go back to the cabin. Eventually, I flew back to Denver. The cabin rental owner apologized, saying they would increase security and notify locals. I never went back. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of those footsteps outside the cabin, the scraping along the wall, the shadow moving just beyond the window. I remember the cold sweat, the fear that made me feel completely alive in a way nothing else ever had. That experience didn't break me, but it changed the way I travel, the way I see solitude, and the way I understand danger. I learned to respect isolation, to prepare, and to trust my instincts above all else. That cabin, the wind, the shadows, they weren't supernatural. They were just the real world. And sometimes the real world is scarier than any ghost story you could imagine.